Hey guys, this is Ben, and today we're going to take a look at 6th grade atheism. And essentially the idea here is that a lot of people, not everyone, hashtag not all atheists, but there are those atheists who, like, when they're 12, 13 years old, 6th, 7th grade, they decide they don't believe in God. And they pretty much never look back. C.S. Lewis was a hardcore atheist, and he said that even in World War One, when it was so bad in those trenches, he said he never sunk so low as to pray. And but he did become a Christian later in life, and he said that the young atheist has to be careful what he reads and protect his atheism. You know, in other words, there are certain things he just has to keep out of his mind. And that's kind of the gist of what I'm talking about with this video. William Lane Craig talks about it too, and I've experienced it a little bit too. You have someone who's like a grown man, 40 years old, 50 years old. William Lane Craig's talking about college professors who, like, they rejected God when they were 12, and they never really studied it or looked into it since. And they rejected God so when you debate with them about the existence of God, you run into the objections of a 12-year-old. And he says it's kind of a joke, a lot of the debates he goes to, because, like, you'll have this one vociferous atheist professor at the university who, like, beats up on the college freshmen in his class, all these 18-year-old freshmen. But when he actually has the debate, one of his peers, an actual professor who's willing to defend the existence of God, you find out that all of his arguments are incredibly sad and just easily refuted. And that's kind of what I want to look at. So I thought, why don't we make a video about the arguments that 6th graders make? Because sometimes 40-year-olds think those arguments are still great because they just really haven't looked into it. And sometimes, C.S. Lewis is right. They have to be careful what they read if they want to stay an atheist. Okay, so the most common one is just, why can't I see God? Why can't I see God? Why can't I see God? In fact, this might be older than, earlier in life than a 12-year-old. This is like a little kid, I can't see God, so how do I know God's real? Hide and go seek, God's always hiding. Well, this one, and what we'll see with all of these 12-year-old arguments is they're really asking the wrong question. That this wouldn't really be a relevant question to ask. This is a completely pointless question. If you wanted to disprove the existence of God, you wouldn't go about it this way. And so I'm not necessarily going to, with this video, talk about proof for the existence of God, but just show that the way that people try to disprove or argue against in some way the existence of God, in many cases, is really, really ill-formed. Okay, so why can't I see God? The problem is if God existed, God is an all-powerful, all-knowing being who exists in all places at the same time, and who transcends time and exists at all times at the same time. So the question is, what would this being look like? You wouldn't, in other words, like, you've never not looked at this being. If the being exists at all times and all places with all knowledge and all power, then, like, it's a forest for the trees question. Why can't I see any trees? Because you're in a forest. In other words, like, this is just like not a good way to argue against the existence of God. The question is, does reality exist? Yes. So then the important question is the nature of reality at its core a personal being, a God, or is it, just inanimate physical matter? That's really the question. You're not asking, does God exist? That's like asking, does reality exist? The question is, what is the nature of reality? So it's not, God is not a thing that, would exist or not exist. He would be everywhere if he existed. So it's more of a question of, is the nature of reality that there's a being behind it all? Okay, so anyway, that's the first one. Now, another one that they do their Sunday school, and they read the story of Noah and the flood, or Jonah and the whale, or Jesus, and Lazarus, and they say, look at all these miracles, David and Goliath, manna from heaven with Moses. I mean, why doesn't God do these miracles today? Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Elijah was raising people from the dead. So they're like, why doesn't God do a miracle today? And so they say, we don't see any miracles today. That stuff never happens. So these are just made up things because that's not how the world works. Okay, and so that's the argument. The problem with the argument is there's a bunch of problems with that argument. There's a bunch of holes with it. So let's just go right down through it. This argument makes a lot of assumptions that are really, really ill-founded, really, really poor, and not very well thought out. So here's one of the first assumptions. Miracles happened all of the time in the past. Did they? Did miracles happen all the time in the past? Just because they happen all the time in the Bible, it doesn't mean they happen all the time in the past. You don't write down in the Bible, we had supper today and went to sleep and nothing special happened. No, why would you write that down? And there's plenty in the Bible where there's no miracles. It's not like they happen on every page. And if the Bible records all the miracles that ever happened, which it probably doesn't, but just imagine, just for the sake of understanding this, if it did, then 99.999% of the time there were no miracles, because we're talking about a lot of human history, okay? And that's not really that many miracles. Really, they didn't happen all the time. They happened sometimes, and it was worthy of being remembered, because it was like, wow, can y'all believe that happened? Okay. Another one is, they never happen anymore. Miracles never happen anymore. It's like, do they? Because we've all heard like a lot of stories. Like I heard a story today about this guy, and he was like in a certain province in China, and there were some missionaries that had been there, and he'd been questioning about the religions that he believed in, and he wanted to seek and understand God better, and he kind of had this weird story. It was a long time ago, but like this guy like found a piece of paper on the ground which was like a profession of faith from the few Christians that live in his area in China, and it just said, are there many gods or only one? And then it's like, there's only one. That was it. That's all he had. It was like a scrap of paper. But based on that, somehow he came to believe that there's just one God. He went home and smashed all his idols and said that he only believes in one God. So then his daughter became sick, and he was like, y'all probably know where this is going, but like he all of his friends and family and everyone said, you're a fool for smashing your idols. This is what happened to you. And instead of going back to the gods that he'd always, followed, in his mindset, in his simple understanding of the one God, he thought, well, if I go to the top of a mountain, he'll hear me better. So he went up to the top of a mountain and said, God, if you really are the one God, if I really should worship you, if you're really there, heal my daughter. And she was healed at the exact time that he prayed the prayer, because this guy decided to believe in the one God, learn more about it, became a Christian evangelist, and he was a very effective evangelist in the region. So we've all got stories like that, and the bottom line is, as prevalent as they are today, who knows, they might be more prevalent today. And you say, well, that's not true, that didn't really happen, that's a made-up story about that guy, and these are all made-up stories. Well, that's irrelevant if you want to say that they're made-up stories. The argument that you made was that we don't see these anymore today, and we saw them a bunch in the past, and that's just not true. We did not see them all the time in the past. We don't know that they saw them all the time in the past, and who's to say that we never see them today? You have to look into these cases and see if there's good evidence for this miracle today, see if there's good evidence for these miracles in the past. You don't just believe in a miracle story in the past or today until you have good evidence for them. Okay? But smart atheists understand that concept, but a lot of times you have these 12-year-old atheists or 40-year-old atheists who think like 12-year-olds who like, they say, well, it happened all the time in the past and that never happens anymore. And it's like, are you sure that it happened all the time in the past? Like, so your argument dissolves into nothing, and it just boils down to just evidence, which is where, we're on an equal playing field. Anyway, one you hear often, I've heard people say this to me, all I need is just for God to just do one miracle. If God would just do one miracle, that would prove to me that there's a God. If God would just do one miracle. And my response to that is, are you stupid? Like, would that really prove the existence of God? A miracle? just because we observe something that science can't explain, it does not mean that therefore God exists. Miracles do not exist to prove the existence of God. And this leads right into the next one, but what I want to make the point right here is, like, a lot of atheists who are a little bit smarter say this is a God of the gaps problem. You know, just because there's something that science, there's always been things that science can't explain. There have been many things that science couldn't explain, and eventually science learned how to explain them. And who's to say that, like, science won't learn how to explain other things? So that just wouldn't prove the existence of the supernatural. It would be maybe considered evidence, but, like, and I don't want to talk about the God of the gaps thing because I've done other videos on it. But this is an atheist. The God of the gaps argument is an atheist argument that deserves more attention than these 12-year-old arguments. But I do want to throw that in there, that, like, that wouldn't prove the existence of God. That would just prove that there's something that you don't understand. It wouldn't prove that there's a God. You know, like, all science today would be basically magic to someone, 3,000 years ago. Your iPhone was just basically magic, a magic tool. That this moving picture on a little handheld screen with, like, all the information in the world, blow their mind. That's pure magic. You'd be God. Are you God? No, you're not God. But they think you're God because they saw your miracle. I mean, it's retarded. Okay. Anyway, but people say it and they don't really, like, question it. Okay. And then the next one is, like, back then everyone had proof that God exists, and because they had all these miracles. And first of all, we talked about, like, did they really? But, like, in the case where some people did see miracles, like, maybe like, you could think of, like, certain times where it was commonplace, where it says, like, they had manna from heaven and, every night, and God led them by a pillar of fire during the night and a cloud during the day. And especially during the Exodus, it seems like miracles were normative to some degree. So, and, let's say maybe in Israel or maybe in the ancient world, it's possible that miracles were normative. Maybe they were normal. We don't necessarily know that. But would that prove the existence of God? No. Miracles in the Bible were never intended to prove the existence of God. The whole question that they were debating was not, does God exist? Does your God exist? Does my God exist? Everyone everywhere believed in everyone's God. The question was, whose God is really in charge? Whose God is really the big shot? That was the purpose of the miracles. And then the Jews had a special system set up by their God where no one will be able to perform a miracle in the name of their God unless their God sent him. So the assumption is, like, you'll see miracles that, but if they don't preach and teach the true God, then that's a definite sign that this is not from God. So in other words, like, miracles would actually function for them as evidence that the person was not sent by God if they weren't preaching and teaching the correct God. So, like, that's why they said that Jesus, had a demon or was demon possessed. Okay. So we come at this with this assumption that there's nothing beyond, the natural physical world, and basically what humans know about the natural physical world is pretty much it. There's no way there's, like, beings that exist beyond our level that we don't understand. There's no way. And if you see something that's way beyond our level, then that would prove, that there's a God or something, or angels or demons. Like, nobody had that question back then. The question was, whose God that this person worshipped, whose God's really in charge? And for the Jews, it was also very important, did our God send you, or were you sent by some false God? Okay. And then the final one we want to look at is a very classic, teenage. This is more teenager level, I guess, but we'll call it a 12-year-old argument. Christians and church people are all a bunch of hypocrites. None of you really believe in God and Jesus. So this is an ill-formed argument. First of all, it's a red herring. It doesn't make God exist or not exist just because in other words, let's say that it's true that there's a whole bunch of people out there who say they believe in God, but they don't really. Does that mean that God doesn't exist? No. Just because a bunch of people do a thing, it doesn't make it the truth. Like, so the Nazis really, really believed in their racist ideals, it doesn't make them correct. Okay, and they had a lot of lies to back it up. It doesn't make it correct. Just because there's a lot of people out there who, believe something, it doesn't really affect it. In other words, in logic, this is a red herring fallacy. This is the appeal to popularity. In other words, typically this is an example of the atheist wanting to feel like he or she is not alone, and that really all these people that go to church, they're all atheists too, and so I'm the only one who's just brave enough to admit it. Blah blah blah. So you see how that works. So that's another example of 12-year-old argument. There's more to this one, because ask yourself this: if an atheist were to pray, this is called the atheist prayer, and just pray, God, if you're real, I don't know, but God, if you are, I want you to save me. And God, save my soul. If I do have a soul. I don't know if I have a soul. I might just be a physical body. But if I have one, God, I want you to save it. Do you think that if there really is a God, that he won't work with that person to save that person? Because that's the person that wants to be saved, is just unsure about the truthfulness of it. What do you think? How do you think God's going to respond to that prayer? A lot of Christian theologians say God will save that person. And that person will come to grow in faith. But there's a faith in that person because that person wants God to exist. And, but is also wanting to be honest in the process. That's not a bad prayer to pray. That's not a bad, because there's an honesty in that. Like, there's this question of, do you want God to exist? Would you like it if God exists? It's a personal question to ask yourself. And that really leads into the next point. The next point is like, have you ever genuinely intended to do something and also failed to do it? Because honestly, we could go right into this question of atheism. You say you're a skeptical, honest atheist who just is holding out for evidence. Is that really what you are? Are you really just a truth-seeking skeptic who is not going to believe anything until you have the proof? Is that really who you are? Or are you someone who says that about yourself, but really you just don't like the idea of God? And it doesn't matter, even if you were given good evidence, you're just closed-minded about it. So, in other words, my point is people are complicated, because I think there are many atheists out there who have sat down and said, I'm going to look at the evidence, but then they don't always follow through on looking at the evidence. And in reality, it's more than just this atheist example. Like, there's infinity examples of where we've all done that, where we've said we have committed with all of our heart to do something and we really believed it, but then we didn't come through on it. And that's just a reality of what it means to be human. I mean, people do that. That's part of life. Paul talks about that in Romans 7, that it's hard to be a person. And this really digs on a more profound question of maybe there's more to what makes people do what they do than just their simple willpower. In other words, maybe there's more that drives you and is behind your actions. So in other words, just because you got a bunch of Christians who say they believe in God, go to church, sing the songs, but then they don't always live like they believe it, that doesn't mean necessarily they don't believe it. People are more complicated than that. And I'll give you an example. Why do we have credit reports? Why do we have credit reports? Because if people are just totally free to do what they want in the moment, and all you do, all your actions are just based on what you choose to do, then credit reports would be kind of dumb, because who's to say that some person who's paid all their bills on time all of a sudden will just stop? And who's to say that some person who never paid a bill on time all of a sudden won't start? In reality, we understand in real life that what goes into what a person really does is more than just it's not as simple as just what they choose to do in the moment. It's not as simple as that. There's more to it that plays into that. And Christianity says that, like, the process of being a Christian, it's not like you flip the switch and you're just the ultimate person who never messes up. That's not Christianity. So this is an argument that atheists use, and they say, like, you accepted Christ and said you believe it, but then you sin still sometimes, so you don't really believe it, so there's no point in me believing it because you don't believe it. It's not as simple as that. Like, people, just because somebody believes something, it doesn't mean that, like, they're completely, all of who they are inside has been completely fixed to where it's totally in conformity. Like there's more to what makes you you than just willpower. In other words, like, if someone tells you lies a lot, you would think, well, that person is a liar. And if someone tells the truth most of the time, you would think that person's honest and trustworthy. But, like, if they have totally free will to do whatever they want in the moment, then, like, all of you, who knows, that in any moment they could just go down a different road and totally switch. What goes into what a person says and does is more complicated than that. There's something more. It's hard for people to change who they are completely. So, I mean, this is just a reality of life. Like, there are plenty of people who really want to stop doing drugs, but they can't. And, there are plenty of people who want to, stop doing a lot of bad things, but they can't. And it doesn't mean that they don't want to do it, but it's not easy always, to do something that's hard to do. And really following God with all of your heart is something that, as the Bible says, it's a process of changing. And so I guess the final thing I want to leave you with here is that if they say this is another ill-formed question. In other words, like, they criticize Christianity because you're not perfect the day you become a Christian, and you're not a perfect person. But Christianity never taught that. So Christianity taught that you become a Christian, but then there's this long process, lifelong process of sanctification. So when you say that Christianity, doesn't meet what it teaches, it never taught what you say it taught. In other words, it's like a straw man. Like, nobody ever said that Christianity teaches you become perfect, the day you become a Christian. So, like, why are you upset with, why does this disprove Christianity when, in other words, when you see Christians struggling to be better like Christ, more like Christ, and follow Christ more closely, that is exactly what Christianity always taught the process of being a Christian would be like. So how does this disprove Christianity when all you're doing is providing evidence, which is that Christianity's claims about what it's like are true? This is literally evidence that Christianity is true, and really, because that's what it always taught. You're just giving examples of how what it taught fits with what we see. Okay, that there is this long process of sanctification where we need to grow more like Christ. If you want an example, 2 Peter 1, he talks about you need to make every effort to grow in all of these attributes. And there's plenty of examples where people might backslide. And so when you say Christianity teaches that you become a Christian and then you never mess up, but Christianity doesn't teach that, and then you provide evidence that this false version of Christianity you created is wrong, well, okay, nobody believes in that false version. This is a straw man. You've made a imaginary Christianity, and that you're beating up because you created one that's easy to beat up, whereas real Christianity fits perfectly with real life. Okay, so anyway, hopefully that video didn't drag on too long. Thank you for your time.